For so many people, this has been such a trying time for them because we know the need for help is greater than ever before. And answering that call for help is the Lighthouse. To talk a little bit more about how they are doing and some of the needs that they need met right now, let's bring in Brian Hertz. He's the president and CEO for the Lighthouse here in Michigan. Brian, thanks again for being with you. It's always great having you.
Good to see you again, Ronnie. Appreciate taking the time to have this conversation.
So with that, tell us, how are things going right now? How is the need? Are you able to assist the people that need it?
It's a tough question. The need is certainly greater than typical, but thankfully the resources to respond to that need have also been significantly greater than typical. So this has been a really interesting time for our organization. Starting right from the beginning of the pandemic, trying to make sure that we were prepared and aligned all of our resources around a robust response for the most vulnerable people in our community that rely on us in normal times to help them navigate challenges. What we didn't expect, what I'm extremely grateful for, is the significant increased investment from the philanthropic community, from foundations in our community, from individual donors in our community, as well as some of the public resources that have come into our community, both directly to individuals in need, as well as to organizations like ours to assist folks. So yes, the need is significantly greater. It's almost unquantifiable at this time. Maybe we'll be able to do a post-mortem and have a better sense of it. But thankfully, we are well equipped. Since the last time I was on your show, for example, we were selected as one of 3 organizations in Oakland County to administer $54 million in rental assistance to stop evictions and to keep folks from becoming homeless, which was frequently the question throughout the pandemic that folks would ask me. What's Lighthouse going to do? We provide an emergency homeless shelter program and housing programs. What's Lighthouse going to do when the eviction moratorium lifts and folks actually start facing evictions? And the answer is, thankfully, that we're well equipped to address rental arrears for qualifying folks and ensure that we don't end up having to pick up the pieces on the other side with a lot of people experiencing the trauma of homelessness. So that doesn't mean that we're on, that we're on the end of this journey by any means, and we certainly have a lot of resources that we provide that we still do need significant financial supports to continue at our current volume. But it's been a challenging but also affirming time for our organization.
So with that, Ryan, too, we have a housing crisis here in the state of Michigan, even prior to the pandemic. And your organization, you're trying to do so much. You do so much. With that, how is the housing crisis, do you anticipate, going to be coming out of this? Because on the other side of that, we do know some of the property owners, the landlords, are struggling to pay their bills as well.
That's true. So when it comes to rental units, we're hopeful that these programs that address rental arrears of tenants will both assist the tenants in maintaining their housing, but also support landlords' ability to provide that service in our community and to continue to invest in the quality and recapitalize properties, et cetera, right? So we do believe that on the rental side, this particular intervention of the, it's called the COVID Emergency Rental Assistance Program, we believe that will be beneficial and hopefully a stabilizing force. That said, prior to COVID-19, just in Oakland County, we had 20,000 households that were at or below 50% of the area median income who were rent burdened. So folks who are already low income and paying more than 1/3 of their gross income on their rent. So we already had a pretty dramatic problem in our community around affordability and rental. We're also seeing, sort of paradoxically, given the current environment, that the single family market has gone up, and that makes homeownership a little bit further out of reach for some of the folks served historically. And there's a lot of folks who maybe we wouldn't have necessarily had to serve historically, who as a result of the changes in the economy as a result of this pandemic are now a part of that population. And with home ownership a little bit further out of reach, and while it may be true that we might be able to stabilize the existing rental capacity of our community, there's still significant need that is only going to have been exacerbated as a result of this particular situation.
Ryan Hertz with us here on the MegaCast. He's the president and CEO for Lighthouse here in the area. And with that, Ryan, too, I know some people that had rental properties that now, because the housing market is so tight, they are, instead of choosing to rent, are putting these houses on the market. And I anticipate that's going to, make the rental market even that much tighter going forward over the next few years.
Yeah, and it's not just people who own rental properties. It's also people who are homeowners that are thinking about maybe they'll sell their home and rent for a little bit to take advantage and try to time the real estate market. And you're right, between those two forces, that will have an impact. That will have an impact. Most of the folks that we serve are predominantly in the multifamily rental market. But certainly that will have an influence that will sort of trickle down, so to speak, to impact that market as well.
So with that, Ryan, we're a year into this pandemic. Do you see light at the end of the tunnel?
Great question. For our organization, we were very, very heavily volunteer reliant prior to the pandemic, and really during the pandemic as well, but in different ways. So we had to pivot to, we went from serving 300 to 400 households a week in our food pantries to 5,000 households a week in our food pantries during this period. And the volunteer force that was required to keep that up was significant and greater than in the past in that area of our work. And at the same time, our emergency shelter, which really relied heavily on volunteers, we had to pivot in order to keep folks safe. In that program is now totally non-congregate, and we're using hotel rooms still to provide that service. So it's interesting to see, a light at the end of the tunnel in the sense that we've been having to worry so much and continuously respond to potential exposures. And thankfully, we've had quite a bit of success in terms of our safety protocols, but the vaccines made a difference, right? Our ability to work with the county and get all of our staff members and regular on-site volunteers vaccinated made a big difference in our ability to refocus a lot of the energy we were spending on trying to keep people safe back to, yes, we're going to continue our safety protocols, but boy, did we just reduce a big chunk of that risk. And we can put a lot more of that energy into figuring out kind of how we land the plane that we built in the air during the pandemic, right? So, yes, I'm seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. Obviously, there's a lot of things that could happen that could push that off further than any of us would like. But to date, what I've been seeing is encouraging.
That is good, because how are you doing on volunteers? Are you starting to get people back that want to volunteer again?
Yeah, we thankfully we have had a great team of volunteers through the entire pandemic, and certainly the greater access to vaccines is only going to help us in terms of the pool of folks who support us that would be willing to be on site and involved in various activities. Yeah, so that has been a big positive.
We're talking with Ryan Hertz. He's the president and CEO for Lighthouse. Any other programs that you have coming up that you want to share?
Sure. So we just completed a 64-unit affordable housing development in Oak Park. All the units are currently spoken for. Whenever I mention this, folks ask about access to those units. The units are spoken for, but we just opened our on-site community center. And we're close to closing and breaking ground on a couple other significant developments. One in partnership with the Pontiac Housing Commission, another in partnership with Catholic Charities of Southeast Michigan. So we're really excited to continue forward, despite, to some degree, we've been sidelined into focusing most of our energy on basic needs emergency services during the pandemic. Happy to be able to say that our longer term initiatives focused on addressing the longer term barriers to ending poverty in our community are still moving ahead full force. And we've had a lot of luck in those areas during this time. Of course, the pandemic has impacted those initiatives as well. Construction on our most recent development was held up a couple of months by the pandemic, and it certainly had an impact, but nothing that we won't be able to weather.
So Ryan, if I can ask you, we know that the focus there at Lighthouse is to help bring people out of poverty. And we see so many businesses right now that are having to reduce their hours or close down because they can't find enough employees. Is there a way to try to bridge these gaps and bring some of the people that need jobs, but maybe are facing other issues, such as especially childcare right now, with more kids learning remotely, or transportation, to try to bring these two sides together and lift everyone up?
It's a really complicated question. A lot of the lower income folks that we serve, a lot of the challenges are that a lot of the jobs that are available to them aren't sustainable for them to take. The cost of taking the job and trying to provide, daycare, whatever else might be necessary for the wages that are being made available, the math doesn't work. And so, our organization is a proponent and supporter of guaranteed basic income as an intervention in our community. It has to come from somewhere. If we have an affordable housing crisis, either we need to create more affordable housing, we need to pay wages so folks can access it, afford housing, or we need to otherwise support those households so that they can afford to work in our businesses in our community. So we are working on a pilot guaranteed income initiative currently with a handful of partners. And I'm happy to see another one of the kind of odd silver linings of the pandemic is that something that I think is generally an unpopular policy has been tested a little bit. And I think folks are starting to see that it isn't necessarily as detrimental as they may have thought, as we've actually seen direct cash payments to our residents, and the value of that to not just the residents but our economy, as we've seen what's essentially amounts to a guaranteed income for children, the additions to the child tax credit. So I think that we have to see somewhere we have to see some relief for the families that we're talking about. And I recognize the challenge for the business community in that. It's hard to afford sometimes in certain lines of business to pay a living wage in our market, just like it's hard for families to afford housing in our market. So, as we continue to look at innovative solutions, I think that, yes, the answer is yes. There are ways. I think we just have to think differently than we have in the past.
So with that, and that's one thing, maybe the silver lining in the pandemic is pretty much every organization, every business, every government entity has had to think outside the box and do things differently. So some of those conversations prior to the pandemic would have been, no way. Now people are rolling up their sleeves and saying, how can we solve some of these problems? So let's hope that continues as we work our way out of the pandemic. And with that, Ryan, we know that you're always in need of donations. How can people help you and your organization out right now?
Certainly. So I appreciate you asking that. Currently, we're running a campaign focused on our COVID-19 emergency response expansion of basic needs services. So while we work in a lot of different areas, everywhere from stability services and housing development and community development, during the pandemic, we have dramatically increased, as I mentioned earlier, the volume of emergency food that we're providing to the community. And that comes at a cost. We are, thankfully, through our partnerships with our friends at Gleaners and Forgotten Harvest, where we're able to access quite a bit of food at a discount. but we're still spending, upwards of $20,000 a week on purchases of bulk wholesale food. And so we estimate that we'll need to raise around $1.5 million this year. Last year, we raised about $3.5 million to cover both the increase in our food costs as well as our hoteling initiative. We believe that we are resourced well enough to continue our hoteling initiative throughout the end of 2021, but we really do need support around the purchase of bulk wholesale food. And so folks can visit our website, lighthousemi.org, to contribute to that initiative. Currently, we have a $50,000 match on all donations, thanks to the McGregor Fund, who have been our friends among many other institutions in our community through this entire ordeal. And so we're grateful to anyone who's able. Of course, we don't want people to stretch themselves beyond what they're able in these times, but to anyone who's able, we greatly appreciate your support.
Well, it seems like throughout this time, we've had a lot of collaboration amongst our businesses and our nonprofits, trying to help organizations such as yours. So it's great to have you. And we wish you and your team the best as you continue on this journey.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. Appreciate it.